perhaps one of the most contentious topics of conversation at the moment is the situation in Gaza, the military action from Israel in response to terrorist actions that happened so many months ago. But of course, since that time, international pressure has mounted against Israel, who have honestly lost a lot of political support and public sympathy internationally. Joining us on the program now, Professor of International Relations at Otago University, Professor Robert Patman. Robert, kia ora, thank you so much for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. Pleasure.
This is a complicated situation, and there was some hope on the horizon, hope perhaps that there could be a ceasefire, some more hostage exchanges, or at least a secure aid corridor. That hope hasn't solidified, I suppose, despite international pressure. Israel is continuing with their military action.
Yes, there was hope that there was hope on two fronts. Excuse me. Firstly, Israel, under pressure from the United States, from the Biden administration, gave undertakings to open up more openings for the distribution of humanitarian aid. The borders between Gaza and Israel had been largely closed, and the aid that's getting in has been very strictly monitored. And so the Americans were demanding that this aid pipeline be extended. There's been some progress, but aid organizations are still pointing to some frustrations. There's indications in the last 3 days that aid has increased, but not of the scale yet where aid agencies believe it will start to make inroads in a problem which is taking on proportions of famine in Gaza.
Now, of course, recently a tragic situation with the death of aid workers in Gaza, and even within the last 24 hours, accusations that aid convoys have been fired on by Israeli forces there. But that is only just one area. There's certainly been extra pressure from Israel's biggest ally, the United States, with US abstaining from a UN mandate, and the call for the UN to recognise Palestine as a state. International pressure is mounting, Robert.
It is, and what has been clear during the last 6 months is that Israel, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, seems to have had problems distinguishing between civilian and military targets. Yeah. And lots of Palestinians, probably more than 33,000 now, unfortunately have died. Some of those would have been Hamas fighters, but we know that 14,000 children have died in the process. So I think the Americans have been expressing concerns about civilian casualties for months, and they feel frustrated that the Netanyahu government has not responded to American concerns. At the same time, America continues to arm Israel. And so there was two areas of movement in recent days. One was, as we've already mentioned, an increase in humanitarian aid. The other was the possibility of a ceasefire. There's been secret discussions which involve senior officials, at least one senior official from the American side. It was hoped that this might generate the need for a ceasefire because, as aid agencies put it, and as the president has put it, we're not going to get a more effective distribution of aid until there is an immediate ceasefire. So the president is now calling for a ceasefire of 6 to 8 weeks immediately. Mr. Netanyahu has said that he intends to go ahead with a full-scale offensive against Rafah, which for the Americans is a red line. So we haven't got to the point yet, but it does seem that Netanyahu and Biden, their relationship is deteriorating quite significantly. And Mr. Biden's under a lot of domestic political pressure as well, Andrew, because he's got an election looming, and there's signs that many Democrats, not just the progressive Democrats, but Democrats like Nancy Pelosi have openly called in an open letter for an immediate ceasefire. So I think Mr. Biden faces a crunch period where if Mr. Netanyahu doesn't respond in the way the Americans want, then the Americans will have to probably start seriously thinking about conditioning their aid for Israel.
And for Israel to lose its strongest ally in this regard certainly may be a game changer. However, Netanyahu is also ignoring UN mandates and certainly some strong pressure from Biden. And it's not just the international pressure on Netanyahu, also unrest within Israel. A lot of people unhappy in some ways. He's holding on to power by a fraction. Do you think that unrest within Israel could lead to disruption?
You pinpointed this very nicely, because I think Israel is a democracy, and there's been, while many Israelis have been prepared to give Netanyahu the benefit of the doubt in going after Hamas, declaring war against Hamas, I think many of them are concerned that Mr. Netanyahu has not done more to get the hostages back. Mr. Netanyahu's response to the critics has been military pressure will get the release of the hostages. Well, so far that hasn't worked out in the way that he hoped. There's also, this is a point that needs to be made. Mr. Netanyahu's political survival, according to his critics, probably depends on him continuing to prosecute the war.
Yes.
The danger for Mr. Netanyahu is if there is a ceasefire, the people like Benny Gantz, the opposition leader, may renew their call for elections in Israel. In which case, Mr. Netanyahu's future may be quite bleak, because opinion polls suggest that he's in deep political trouble.
But if he holds on to power for the time being, then he may lose all of his allies. I suppose to look at the long game, because you mentioned the US elections, of course, coming up at the end of the year. If Netanyahu can hold out until November with the possibility of a change of presidency, it may be a different situation for him.
It could be, but I think that's quite a long period in time. Somebody once said a week is a long time in politics. I have a feeling that we're reaching a crunch point. It was interesting watching the New Zealand Foreign Minister, Mr. Peters, in the UN General Assembly deliver a pretty hard-hitting speech about the situation in Gaza, which he described as an utter catastrophe and a wasteland. And he expressed open criticism of the use of the veto. He didn't name the United States directly, but it was quite clear who he was directing his criticism towards. He also said that Israel's settlements, illegal settlements under international law, not just in Gaza, not so much in Gaza because they left Gaza 2005, but in the West Bank, were fueling tension. And Mr. Peters finished by restating his support for a two-state solution. As he put it, there has to be a state available for the Palestinians to have. So the situation is precariously balanced. Let's be quite frank about this, trying to put politics to one side if we can. This is a crisis of humanity.
It is.
In the 21st century, we're facing a situation where an unbelievably appalling attack on Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October has led to a disproportionate response, which has led to the loss of life of many innocent people. And that in turn, unfortunately, will not solve Israel's security problems.
No.
It may actually expand them.
Now, looking at, we started with this, but just wanting to get your thoughts on it, given also, as well as the damage of war, the collateral damage with civilians, the damage to infrastructure, there's a loss of political support and public sympathy globally for Israel as a result of this action. Regardless of what happens in the war, regardless of what happens politically, in terms of their international support and public goodwill, is there any way back for Israel? Certainly it's a long, hard road if there is one.
I think Israel is a democracy, and I think that many liberal democracies, with the exception of the US, many liberal democracies are now having grave doubts whether Netanyahu can be the sort of leader that can make a constructive political contribution to solving the problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And He's consistently ruled out a two-state solution.
Yep.
He opposes the idea of a Palestinian state. So I think that many liberal democracies may be hoping for a change of government in Israel and perhaps a fresh appraisal of the relationship with the Palestinians.
And hey, in amongst this, some serious health concerns for Netanyahu and some corruption charges as well. So whatever happens first in that regard. Robert, certainly appreciate your wisdom and insight as always. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.